Okay. The book of Esther. So let's just open this up by discussing a little bit about what the book is, why the book is here. The title of the message is always setting the stage. So, I think when you say the book of Esther, there's not a ton of Old Testament stories that the church really has a great idea of. The moment you say the name of the book of Esther, oh, I know what that is. And we very, very often go in our heads to the climax of the book, to that great conclusion when Esther goes before the king. And that's the great conclusion to the book. And there's so many lessons there of God's providence and her faith and courage and all of those things. But interesting, before we can get to those things, we have these 3 chapters that set the stage for that to even come to pass. And I want to intentionally ask you today to think about how many chapters there are in the book of Esther before we even get to the problem that this book is going to solve. There are people, there are places, there are things in this book that God sets up that have to happen to be able to get to that place where we can see the providence of God to deliver the Jews, where we can see Esther's great courage and boldness and faith in God. There are things that need to be set up first. So who's the author of this book, Esther? Well, we know it had to have been a Jew closely related to the affairs of the palace, but also a Jew. It had to be a Jew. So Mordecai is likely who we're going to find is Esther's cousin. I think so many times we read these stories and it says that he was her uncle. Cousin is the best translation of these words here in the book. So at this time, set the stage on where we're at. Now, we've just come through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and we talked in those books about these 3 waves of times when Jews returned back to the land after the Persian kingdom began to allow them to go back. They first started to go back under Zerubbabel and Joshua around 536 BC, and then years later, in the second half of the book of Ezra, is when Ezra himself led the next wave of people back, right? Well, where Esther takes place is after that first wave of return under Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua, and before Ezra, the priest, came back to Israel. So that's the time period where this is at. So what's happening in Israel at the time that Esther starts? Well, we've got the altar in Jerusalem has been rebuilt under Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest, but they haven't rebuilt the temple. The entire temple. They haven't rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem or the city, and they've only got maybe 30 or 40,000 Jews that have returned back to Israel. Now, there are more scattered in lots of different places, but that's the conditions at the time when this book is written. So please remember that. This basically takes place after Ezra chapter 6, but before the man Ezra comes on the scene in Ezra chapter 7. So this account takes place in just a few 10-year period of time, around 483 BC until 473 BC is when this takes place. The theme of Esther really centers around you could put it in a question. Do you have faith to be a part of God's providential plan and be blessed for it? Do you have the faith to be a part of his plan? See, when we read the story of Esther and Mordecai, it's not just the story of what they did. It's also the encouragement for us to do the same and be a part of the same blessing that they were a part of. So God is always trying to set the stage of our life, and today we get to see the stories of how he set the stage in their life. God is orchestrating. When you think of orchestra, what do you think? Many pieces, right? Many different things that have to come together. That is a great way to look at this. God is orchestrating many more pieces into our life and out of our life than we can even imagine. You think of just the people, the events, the places that come in and out of our life at any given time. This is the idea. This is what God's doing. There's many things that he's moving around. So that's why I've titled this message on the first couple chapters of Esther as Always Setting the Stage. God is always setting the stage for what is to come and to ultimately fulfill his plan. God is involved with us, and ultimately it's because he cares about us as individuals. He wants to give us chances to shine, opportunities to show our faith and trust in him. That's what he's doing. He's setting up things for us to have a chance, have an opportunity to glorify him. So we're going to look at three ways today that God sets the stage of our life to accomplish in us his purposes. So it's a very easy outline for tonight. Chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. 3 separate chapters, 3 separate points. Chapter 1, the first point we're going to look at is that for setting the stage of our life, oftentimes God has to move pieces out of our life. Has that ever happened to you? Whether it's a person, a place, a thing, something had to get moved out of your life before you could move on to the next thing, to the place that God wanted you to be. Unfortunate as it sounds, there are sometimes things that come into our life that are hindering, that are holding back. And God will orchestrate the events of our lives to take care of those things. And I believe we see that here in Esther chapter 1. This chapter 1, it's the story of King Xerxes' wife Vashti and his divorce from her. And she gets divorced, and we're going to see later that then Esther comes in to replace her as the queen. Have you ever thought to yourself, why do I have a whole chapter here to open up the book of Esther about this Vashti that used to be the queen? I'm never going to hear from her ever again in the Bible. Why is it here? Have you ever thought that? And I'm telling you, it's because God wants us to see how he's setting the stage. How there's times where there's things that he has to not just bring into your life, there's times that he has to bring things out of your life. And this is step 1. How can Esther rise to the place that she's going to be if this chapter was never here, if this chapter never happened, right? So this chapter 1 is the divorce of Vashti from King Xerxes. We'll get his name here. His name is Ahasuerus, in the Hebrew, in the Greek, it's Xerxes. In the Persian, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but that's probably the way they said it, okay? So we often go by the Greek form of his name, Xerxes, but in the scriptures, you're often going to see the name Ahasuerus because that is his Hebrew name. So Esther chapter 1, it's verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Xerxes, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces. We're going to read an extended section here, verse 2. That in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on his throne, the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, that means all of his generals and army, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being all there before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty for many days, even for 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all people that were present in Shushan the palace, both small and great, for 7 days, in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where there was white, green, blue hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon the pavement of red and blue and white and black and marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold. They weren't paper cups. They weren't china. They were gold. Are you getting the flow of this? The vessels being diverse one from another. They were handcrafted is the idea. And royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law. None did compel. I mean, it was free. You didn't have to. So the king the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. So, wow, all of these verses, and it's just simply trying to get the thrust out there. Look, after he came home, so in those days, the kings went out to war, right? He's running 127 provinces, or you could say micro kingdoms, underneath him from all over. Did you notice that was from India, the whole way over, and that is modern Pakistan, close to India today, the whole way across the Middle East into Africa. This is what he ruled. In fact, he even ruled up into modern Turkey. He ruled all of what is modern Turkey, his kingdom, right up against modern Greece. He even controlled one or two of the provinces of modern Greece. That's the extent of his kingdom. In fact, he's having conflicts at this point in the reign of the Medo-Persians. They're starting to have conflicts with the Greek city-states, Sparta and Athens and all of those. So, remember the grand scope of things of where we're at. I mean, you had the Egyptian kingdom long ago, under the days of Moses and Joseph that ruled the world. And then you had the Babylonian kingdom just a few years before this. Now you've got the Medo-Persians running everything. After this, the Greeks are going to take over, and then after that, the Roman Empire. See, all through these centuries and centuries, you had a kingdom that pretty much dominated the world until after the days of the Roman Empire. And then things finally split up into nations and states. So he's running 127 sub-kingdoms under this massive rule of his. And all of these verses is just designed to demonstrate the absolute affluence of how great it was. He went out to battle, and then after the king would come back from battle, they would celebrate. They would celebrate a victorious time being out to battle. This is the 180 days. They basically recognized the 180 days and celebrated it, and then they threw this party at the end of the 180 days. I think it's in verse 5. Oh, let's see. Where is it? After the 180 days, what did they do? Show the riches of his glory and his kingdom for many days, even for 180 days. In verse 5, and when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present at Shushan. Does it say the exact amount of days? Maybe it doesn't. Just that they celebrated at the end of that time. If it's there, shout it out to me. But 7, there it is. It's 7. So they celebrated is the point. But look at the affluence of all of the things that they brought out. That's what I want you to not miss. They were drinking from golden cups. This isn't just the king. This is all of his leaders, all of his generals, all of his governors, all of them. And so what a time. This is a major deal. I want to make sure you're not picturing, you and a couple of your buddies out back, in the trailer, kicking back a few drinks. This is not that. This is a major party. This is a big deal showing the amazing control and influence of this kingdom. In fact, it says they were at Shushan, the palace. That's come up several times throughout the different books, from the book of Daniel through Ezra, Nehemiah, and now here in Esther. Shushan was the winter palace of the Persian kings. So they were throwing this party for not just for morale, but also for coordination. He would have gotten together with his generals and planned their next trips. In fact, from this date here in 483 BC, just 2 years after this, Persia would be launching their major invasion against Greece. So it's only a few short years until that happens. During the time of this book, during these 10 years, is when the king, Xerxes, goes up against Persia and loses during the reign of Esther. All of these great historic events you've read about in school happened during this reign. So it's a major, major time period in geopolitics for the whole world. And that is when God chooses to raise up the story of Esther. So take a look here in verse 9. This party is going on. It's a major event. In verse 9, also Vashti, the queen, she made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belongs to the king Ahasuerus. And on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded a list of names. He commanded all of these people, Mehuman, Biztha, and all the rest of them. There was 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king. that he commanded them to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. In verse 12 it says, but the queen, Vashti, refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth or angry, and his anger burned within him. Now look, he asked for the queen to come, and it expressly says he wanted to show her off for her beauty. Now look, we can put our bias into that, and we can think that he's thinking something perverted, and then you'll think she's right to defend herself. Or maybe he was saying, look, I'm just proud of my wife, and I want her to come. And maybe it was completely innocent, and she was just offended for no good reason. It could be either one. Now, I've seen commentaries and smart people go way down both of those trails and try to be very, very dogmatic on one or the other. You know, like, oh, the king was asking for something perverted. Or, oh, the king, he just simply wanted his wife. We don't know. We don't know. And I think that's interesting. Because when it's not clear in the text, what it tells me, and this applies to many things in the scripture, when something like that is not clear in the text, you know what it triggers my mind to think about? I think the Lord wants me to think about another part of the story. It must not be that fact that's that important, or else he would tell me. We don't know if he was asking for something rude or if he was just asking for something simple and benign. But what we know is that Vashti decided to stand up against the king with her life on the line. She decided to stand against the king. Again, we can't be dogmatic whether she was right or wrong on this. She should be so loved of her husband, the king, that she should want to do what her husband asks of her. So in that case, you could say, well, she was wrong for not coming. But she shouldn't be paraded as a symbol of nothing but physical beauty. So if you look at it that way, well, she's perfectly right in refusing such a request. So consider that, think of it this way. We're going to find out that she stands up for this issue. She chooses this issue to live and die about. You ever heard the expression, that's the hill I'm going to die on? Or the opposite, that's not a hill I want to die on. You know what that means, right? It's saying, I choose this issue to go to bat. I am going to jump into this issue no matter the cost. I'm going to take a stand. Well, she chooses this issue to make her issue. Now, what I find interesting about this is that Vashti chooses this issue that seems pretty trivial, and it ultimately, even if she was right, that he was trying to parade her as some sex symbol, it's not going to help anybody but her. This great issue that she decides to stand for is really just to defend self. Whereas Esther, we're going to see her come on the scene. We're going to see her set up as the queen, and she decides to put life on the line to defend many people, many other people. And I believe that that's part of the reason why the Lord has given us this chapter about Vashti. To make the point, here we have Vashti. She decides to stand up to do what? To help herself. That's it. That's the extent of what it's for. I think sometimes we need to endure some trivial issues. We need to endure some trivial things so that we can stick around long enough to actually stand up for something that is going to be super consequential, something that will help other people. You have to wonder, what would have happened had she just stayed around long enough to stand up for an issue that would have helped others? But she doesn't. She decides, this is the hill I want to die on, and she will end up being dethroned and taken out of being the queen because this is the issue she chooses. And so let's continue the story here. Verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner towards all that knew the law and the judgments. And next unto him was All of these men, including, notice the last name in the list is Memucan. He's going to come up later. These were the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, and which sat the first in the kingdom. So these were the leaders with the king. In verse 15, what shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to the law? Because she has not performed the commandment of King Ahasuerus by the chamberlains. He sent the chamberlains to get her, and she refused. What should we do? Verse 16. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all of the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. Memucan is stretching this out. Look, she didn't just wrong you. She could start a trend here by her rebellion, is his counsel. And so it continues and says, for this deed, in verse 17, this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deeds of the queen, thus shall they arise to much contempt and wrath. So in verse 19, if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, because that's the custom of the Persian law. Let this be written, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. So this is Memucan's counsel, that listen, if you don't deal with this personal issue, then what she did will cause all the women of the land to rise up in rebellion against their own husbands. So the king is supposed to represent all authority. He cannot have his authority refused, right? This is the idea. And they know that idea will spread if they let this go. Now look, maybe the king is making a foolish, drunken request to have her come, but now he's forced to deal with the problem. Now he's forced to deal with the fact that he has anyone in his kingdom refusing him and his authority as king. I think the same thing happens for us. Sometimes we make foolish decisions, and then we have to settle for the consequences. That happens so many times in raising kids that okay, you guys can stay up a couple extra hours tonight, and then the next morning they're miserable and we have to put up with it because we let them stay up like 3 extra hours. And I think that could be what's happening to the king. Maybe he made a foolish request, but now he has a situation that he fears is going to spread. But ultimately, this happening, whether it was a foolish, drunken decision by the king to have the queen come, or whether it was just a simple request, in either event, what we know is that this is the province of God. This is laying out the exact way that it had to happen. That even if it was a foolish decision by the king, this is happening so that Vashti gets deposed and Esther will come in. This will open the door providentially to put his servant, Esther, right in the influential place that she needs to be. See, God knows what's in the heart of Haman coming up later. To go against the people of Israel. And God is already orchestrating things in the Jews' lives to bring to pass what is needed to save the Jews. He's already doing it. And it begins with even sometimes God brings things out of your life. Like he's removing Vashti from the scene. And I'm telling you, the same thing will happen to us. Not every subtraction from our lives is a bad one. I've heard pastors say that too. Look, I had, people will say, I've had 2 people in my church, they were fighting for months. And I was praying for those guys to get reconciled to each other. And then they'll say well, the Lord answered my prayer. One of them left, And sometimes that's the Lord's answer. Subtraction. Somebody's got to go and see clearly on the other side of that thing. And that's what's happening here. Now finish the chapter here, verse 20. When the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all of his empire, for it is a great empire, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to the great ones and the small ones. And that just means to the powerful ruler men and to the servant men and just all of them. Verse 21, and the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house. Oh, I'm going to get back to that. And that it should be published according to the language of every people. That's it. Now we're going to have to make a decree, and we're going to have to make it a formal law that every husband has the right to rule his own house. So the edict goes out. All husbands, you now have the full rule in your own house. What do you think, Christian? What do you think, New Testament Christian? Does that sound like a good law? Don't answer that. I'm setting you up. Especially if you're a husband, don't answer that. I'm setting you up. Well, it might sound like a good law, but the problem is it's only half the law that's needed. That's the problem with it. See, Jesus knew the only way for wives to want to honestly and sincerely be able to submit to a law like this, to be able to submit to a husband, was to be given their own principle. If this is the principle for the husbands, you have the right to rule. Then the other half of this is that husbands, you also have the obligation to love your wives. And that's what's missing from this commandment. Jesus knew better, right? When Jesus gave the principles to the church, he didn't say, husbands, you have the rule, or, wives, submit to your husbands. He gave that and the other half of it, which is, husbands, love your wives. Love them like you, better than yourself. And see, if the husband's doing that, then the wife will want to submit to the rule of the husband in his own family. So I was setting you up to say, is this a good law? The answer should be no, because it's only half the law. You got to have both halves to make it a good one. So this is the commandment that goes out. Now Vashti has been deposed from being the king. And are you still left with a little confusion? Like, well, was he right in getting rid of her, or was it wrong? Or, was she right in standing up, or was it wrong? I think we're intended to be a little bit foggy on that issue. I really do. I think it's not intended to answer that. I think the chapter is here intending to say, look at how at a moment's notice, some silly thing can happen, and all of a sudden, pieces get moved out of your life, which opens the stage, opens the door for God to do something else. I think that's the lesson of chapter 1, not to miss. So don't get tied up with, was the king a pervert, or was she just being ridiculous? Don't get tied up with that. Get tied up with the fact that God knows how to move pieces out of your life when it's best to do so, to make room for other things to come in. That's what's happening. In the grand scheme of things, that's what's happening. So now as we go to chapter 2, in chapter 2, we're finally now introduced to Esther. And if chapter 1 was God knows how to move things out of our life, chapter 2 is God knows how to move things into our life. And when we least expect it, our lives get moved, and all of a sudden we've got a new job, and now I'm around completely new people. Or all of a sudden I have a new hobby, or I go to some event, and all of a sudden there's like this new person there, and I meet, and now he's my best friend. Boom, 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 just like that. Things can change in our life where all of a sudden there's some new thing happening in our life, and it just comes out of nowhere. And not always because we plan it. It just happens. Take a look at how Esther gets introduced on the scene here. It's chapter 2. We begin with verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of the king, Xerxes, was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Now, you have to recognize that when it says after these things, this is referring to a time period has passed. He's gone out to war again. He's come back. And what happens when a man comes back after being out in the field or out for a while, or even if you're gone for a week, or a month, you come back home and you start thinking about the home fires. Are the home fires burning? And he comes back from another trip and he's like, man, that's right. I don't have a wife anymore. Oh. And he starts thinking, I could really use a wife. And so now that he's back from war, this is what he's longing for a wife again. Verse 2. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins in Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hegi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given to them. And let the maiden which pleased the king become queen in place of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. So they decide to have a beauty contest to pick the next queen. So the search is on for the next queen. This is the plan. And so verse 5, now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew. Can I address that real quick? There was a certain Jew. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the scripture we haven't come to that word yet. We've just begun to be familiar with the word Jew in Ezra, Nehemiah, and here in Esther. It wasn't in the Old Testament before that. Did you notice that? The word Jew comes from the root word meaning of Judah. So the idea is that once they were kicked out by Babylon out of the land, when they came back to the land, where did they go? They went to the old territory of Jerusalem, which was in the tribe of Judah. So that's when they first began to take on this title of being called Jews. So in the New Testament, that's why you most often hear them not called Israel, but you most often hear them called the Jews. Jesus was the King of the Jews, because it's just talking more of the territory that they first started going back to there at Jerusalem, which was a part of Judah. So that's where the word Jew comes from, in case you were ever wondering that. So again, in verse 5, now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai. He was the son of Jair, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Kish, who was a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. So Hadassah is her Hebrew name, Esther is her Persian name. His uncle, I'm going to say verse 7, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. An uncle's daughter is a cousin. For she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So he brought her in and he finished raising her, is the idea. So Mordecai was a Jew whose family has been there in the land for more than 100 years. It mentions in verse 5, Mordecai's ancestor Kish was alive at the time when Babylon first invaded, and Kish went into the Babylonian captivity. So all of those generations of that family there in verse 5 lived in captivity. Kish was there with his wife, and they had a son Shimei, and Shimei had a son Jair. Jair had a son named Mordecai, and that's the guy we're talking about now. So he's been raising his orphaned cousin Esther for these past however many years there in Persia. I love the fact that it mentions that Esther was beautiful to look upon. That is not a shame. This isn't something, strange or even wrong or perverted. This is good. It's a good thing. When you read something like that, what you should read is, oh, God's gifted her with something. We're all gifted with something. She's gifted with beauty. Whatever we're gifted with, use that for the glory of God, right? If it's physical, mental, spiritual, use all of our gifts for the glory of God, right? And she will. And she will. She will end up using this for the glory of God. That's what we should do with it. I just watched a great testimony. I don't know if you've heard of, I don't even know what you call them, internet sensations, I guess. Dude Perfect. Have you ever heard of Dude Perfect? So they started with trick shot videos, and they got super famous. And I just watched one of the guys in the group's testimony. Him and his wife had given their testimony. And you know, that's exactly what it came to be at the end of his story. At the end of his testimony, really the punchline to this testimony, it's not a salvation testimony, but it's a testimony of how God changed him. The punchline to his story was, he realized after all these years of all of this success and all of this money and meeting all these celebrities and doing all of these events, that God wanted to use that for his glory. And he was completely convicted that he needed to give the gospel at the end of every one of his tours. He needed to present the gospel. And so same concept. Whatever you've been given, just use it for the Lord. You know, when you first get saved, you don't have to become a different person. You simply have to use who you are for the glory of God. Right? Esther doesn't have to all of a sudden, I almost said it the wrong way. She doesn't have to become Amish. She doesn't have to all of a sudden hide, herself. You can use who you are for the glory of God. And that's what's important. There are plenty of beautiful Amish people. Don't get me wrong. All right. Okay, we will strip that one from the video recording. Verse 8. Let's keep going. So it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. So even here we begin to see God's hand is a part of this. God's hand is in this, in choosing her to become a part of the group of the ladies that now have a chance to be interviewed by the king. And maybe she'll become the queen. She's now in that group. God's hand is in this. God is orchestrating this. When did she gain her beauty? Basically from birth. God has been orchestrating this since before she was even born to put her in this position. And now it's going to come to pass. Verse 9, and the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet or good to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. So even here in this verse, we're getting the idea that Esther found favor in the eyes of this chamberlain, this eunuch that was over the women that were being gathered together to be interviewed by the king. She found favor with him. In the beginning of verse 9, the maiden pleased him, this man that was set over them, Haggai. And so just God's working in her life, God to bring her into this group. And now the man that's running this job interview, more or less, she's found favor with him, and God's orchestrating all of these things to happen in such a way. Now, verse 10, Esther had not shown her people, nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her or commanded her that she should not show it. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. So it's clearly saying that Mordecai asked her to hold back and not reveal her identity as a Jew. Now, we're told that, we're told in the New Testament, if we deny Jesus, he'll deny us. But if we acknowledge Jesus, he'll acknowledge us, right? Well, this is not akin here to denying her faith and her identity. It's more like waiting for a strategic opportunity. Mordecai is not saying to Esther, look, if somebody looks you in the eye and says, what nation are you from? He's not saying lie to them. He's just saying, look, don't just be out there telling everybody that you're a Jew. That's the idea. It's akin to if, it's a little bit like playing dumb if somebody comes to your door, some cult comes to your door and wants to tell you about their false religion. It's a little bit like holding back your knowledge. Just wait, let's see what they have to say. Just kind of hold back and then spring it on them and let them know what you know then at the right moment. So this is the idea. It's sort of like, it's not, Esther, I want you to lie to them. It's, Esther, just hold back and wait. You don't have to say everything that's on your mind all the time, right? That's the idea. Verse 12. Now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been there 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purification accomplished, to wit, 6 months was with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given to her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king. So each of these women got their choice of jewelry and things that she could put on and then go in for her one night with the king. Great movie, by the way. Verse 14. And in the evening she went, on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women to the custody of that guy, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. So 12 months are going by to get these ladies, sufficiently Persian enough to go before the king. And then they spent an evening with the king for him to get to know them. That's the idea here. One at a time, they would get to go in and sort of be interviewed by the king. And in verse 15, now when the turn for Esther, the daughter of Abigail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing. Now remember, what they're saying is they gave each of these ladies a chance to take whatever jewelry and beauty, what else you want to call it, accoutrements? They gave them a chance to bring whatever they wanted. But it says here about Esther that she chose to bring in, verse 15. She required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed to her. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. Now we're beginning to see the heart and the character of this beautiful woman, which certainly is even more valuable than the outward beauty. It's Esther's turn, and she decides that she doesn't need much jewelry. She doesn't need the outward adorning of just the jewelry to make herself beautiful and worthy. She sees herself as much more than that. But she does take what the eunuch told her. See, this goes back to a few verses ago where it says that she found favor with this eunuch. This eunuch and her struck up a good relationship. They had mutual respect for each other. And so when she decides to go before the king, she takes his advice on the simple couple things to take. Because she knew that he knew the king. And the eunuch is trying to help her. Look, the king doesn't need you to wear 1,000 pieces of jewelry. The king would be happy with just this. And she does. I appreciate this, that she's not afraid to just, be herself. And she's not afraid to just get a little friendly advice from somebody that knows the king. She doesn't have to do that typical thing. Do you ever feel like you have to do the typical thing to go along with the world? Well, everybody at my age does X, Y, or Z. I guess I have to too. She doesn't feel that way at all. In fact, it's going to end up winning for her. She's going to win the heart of the king by being herself and being able just to take a little advice from somebody that's trying to help her. So she appreciates that. So it works. And now in verse 16, it says, So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is in the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So this is now 4 years on since the divorce of Vashti, and now Esther is made queen here in the presence of the king and everyone. And interesting enough, this is immediately after a crushing defeat of Persia by the Greeks at Salamis. This King Ahasuerus or Xerxes, he just went up against a major battle against the Greeks at Salamis and lost. So that's when he comes home and he marries Esther. And so it's, what is the Lord doing in putting these things together? Only God knows. But in God's providential will, he sets up all of these things to have Esther in the right place for the right time. And so now verse 20, verse 18, the celebration is on. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. Now, maybe the release was a release from taxes. Maybe the release was a release of money from the treasury. We don't know if this was money or houses or gifts, but it's a party. Verse 19, and when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate, which of course is the place of judgment of a leader. And Esther, in verse 20, had not yet shown her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up under him. So the celebration is on, and now we see Mordecai sitting in the gate, which basically is indicating, it wants to make sure we understand that Mordecai, although a Jew, was a high-ranking officer in the Persian government. To sit in the gate of a city meant you sat in the place of judgment. If there was disputes in the city with merchants coming in or out of the gate, you were there to settle the disputes. He was some type of magistrate or judge for the Persians right there at Shushan. So we finish the chapter here in verse 21. And in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, they were angry, and they sought to lay hands on the king. Why is that? Because the king just suffered his first defeat to the Greeks at Salamis. We just talked about that. And so we've got this behind-the-scenes look at how these two guys were, Bigthan and Teresh. I mean, how about the nickname Big? Hey, Big, come here. Maybe they called the other one Small, just to make, I don't know. Big, hey, Big and Small. So they're conspiring now against the king to take him out. And in verse 22, the thing was known to Mordecai, whom told it to Esther the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. So do you get the idea? Mordecai is the one who found out that these two guys were plotting to kill the king. So Mordecai got word to Esther, hey, Esther, this plot's going down. You got to go warn the king. And she did. She went in and she warned the king. Verse 23, and when inquisition was made about this matter, it was found out. Therefore, they were both hung on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. And so this will ultimately be a 13-year marriage between Esther and Xerxes. It will end up being a 13-year marriage. Xerxes is going to end up being assassinated by Artabanus, who was the commander of his royal bodyguard, by the way. So, we don't get that in the scriptures, that this is only going to be a 13-year marriage, but sure enough, it will be. So there were threats coming all the time. His royal bodyguard is going to end up being the guy that takes him out about 12 years from this point in the story. It's not in the Bible, but it's real, just like this is real. And so these threats, like that we read from big and little right here, they happened a lot. And this one was found out by Mordecai and relayed through Esther to the saving of the life of the king. So, though loyal to God, the believers are also loyal to the ones that God's entrusted to them, right? And that's what we see here. They're loyal to their earthly rulers just like they're loyal to God. We should be. The New Testament commands us that, right? To honor the king, honor those that are placed in authority over us, pray for those put in authority over us. There is only a super rare time that when those two authorities in our life conflict, then we must obey God. But other than that, we need to be this. We need to be these people that would defend our king, defend our governors, defend them when they're doing what's right. Or even when they're doing something that's questionable, but it's not ungodly, it's not unbiblical, then we need to let them have that authority. It's okay to disagree with them, but we need to support their right to make that call. And it's a nice story of Esther and Mordecai looking out for the king. That they may not agree with everything he's doing, but they recognize him as the authority that's been placed. Now, let's press into to chapter 3. It's only 15 verses. And this really finishes the thought. Again, before we even get to the story that we all know about Esther, about this brave entrance to the king that's going to come later, these 3 chapters set it all up. And I believe chapter 1 was there simply to show us how, for God to even get us to those moments where he wants to really use us, sometimes he's got to move pieces out of our life. Chapter 2, we see how God's moving pieces into Esther's life, into Mordecai's life, into the king's life, putting things together. But chapter 3 now demonstrates the last part, really, of setting the stage, which is all of this setting of the stage is now bringing together the opportunities to show faith. In other words, the problem finally rears its ugly head. And that's what we have in chapter 3. The actual problem that's going to need God's servants to intervene and get involved with finally comes up. So chapter 3, we now have this decree of Haman. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these things, did King Xerxes promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, who was an Agagite. That's what's important about Haman. He was of the family of the Agagites. Okay? And so the king advanced him and set his seat above all of the princes that were with him. In verse 2, all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did he give him reverence. Then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing thou the king's commandment?" In other words, oh my goodness, do you realize in not bowing to Haman the chance that you're taking? That's what they're saying to him. Now this, first of all, this is important to recognize who Haman is. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but Haman, it says here, is of the family and the lineage of he's an Agagite. He's of Agag. Does the name Agag ring a bell? King Agag? Well, way back in the days of King Saul, even before the reign of King David, King Saul was told by God through the prophet Samuel to go wipe out all the Amalekites. Take them out. Their time of judgment had come. God is the only one that can declare that somebody, their time of judgment has come. It's time to wipe them out. And God said that about the Amalekites and their king, Agag. Well, we know that story, and we know that King Saul decided not to wipe out all of the Amalekites. He kept King Agag alive. And other things too. Well, I kept some animals alive because I'm just going to sacrifice them for you, God. He disobeyed. And that's what got King Saul kicked off the throne and replaced by David. So this man, all of these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, is of the lineage of that King Agag that was never put to death. That should have. It should have been put to death. And so this Haman probably was raised in his blood to hate the Jews that slaughtered most of their lineage and most of their family. And so Mordecai must have known something about Haman to not bow to him. And that's the setup we have in chapter 3. Haman's asking everyone to bow to him. Now, why does Mordecai refuse to do this? We don't know for sure. It doesn't say. It could have been that Haman was claiming deity, like many kings in that day did. I'm a god, bow to me. And that would have been sufficient reason for Mordecai not to do it, right? But maybe it was simply that Mordecai knew who Haman was and knew that he was an Agagite. And he knew better than to bow to somebody that was determined of God to be his enemy. So he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't bow. And so now we have this animosity now between this new high ruler Haman and this lowly judge, Jew Mordecai. Verse 4. Now it came to pass, when they spoke daily with him, and he hearkened not unto them. So all of Mordecai's buddies are saying, listen, just bow to this guy. We don't want trouble. He hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did he reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had shown him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all of the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. So the idea is that Mordecai's like, look, I'm not bowing to him, it's because I'm a Jew. And maybe he was saying, I'm not bowing to him because I'm a Jew, and God told me the Agagites are our enemy. Or maybe Mordecai is saying, I'm not bowing to him because I'm a Jew, and I only worship one God, and he's claiming to be a God, and I won't do it. Whichever one it was, the idea is that the word got out. The word got back to Haman. Hey, this Mordecai, he won't bow to you, and he says it's because he's a Jew. And so maybe Haman already knew what that meant. Or maybe Haman was like, Jew, why does that ring a bell? Jew, what are Jews? And he's looking up in the history books. And he's like, oh, I know what the Jews are. And he goes and he remembers the story of his ancestors. One way or the other, whether he knew right away or whether he had to find out later, he all of a sudden turned his entire animosity against this one man, Mordecai, and now he's turning his animosity against all of the Jews because of this one man. So Haman, he could have let this matter go. But he clearly had a bone to pick with the Jews. Justice would have been to just correct Mordecai. If you're Haman, justice would have been to correct Mordecai. Wrath would have been to crush Mordecai. I'm going to throw him in prison, or I'm going to kill him, or whatever. That's wrath. It's satanic to say, I am so upset with what Mordecai did, I'm going to wipe out all of the Jews. That is otherworldly. That's satanic. That comes from the pit of hell. And how many other times throughout history has that happened? That somebody was inspired to wipe out all of the Jews. That is a spiritual thing that's happening. That's not a human thing to say, therefore I'm going to wipe out all of them. That's satanic. It sure is. Verse 7. In the first month, that is in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, or pur. That is a lot. That's what it is. It's a dice. Okay? They cast pur, or dice, or lots. I'm going to say pure, okay? But it is a dice. That's what it is. Die? It is a die? Yeah, die. Okay. So they did this. They cast this pure before Haman from day to day and from month to month to the 12th month. That is the month Adar. Okay, the idea is that Haman is casting this dice to determine what month he's going to go execute his plan of killing all the Jews. It would end up being 11 months before he effects his plan. That's what it says. It came up to be the 12th month. So 12 months from this time, when he determines he wants to kill the Jews, that's when his plan is going to get executed, to execute the Jews. That's his idea. So good and bad. I mean, good, they've got some time for intervention to happen, but bad that he wants to wipe out all the Jews. So we have this word used here, the pure, or the pur. Okay, the plural in the Hebrew is the I am at the end of a word, right? Like how about cherub? What is a cherub? It's a type of angel. What is cherubim? Multiple. Cherub, exactly right. That's why that's one of my pet peeves if somebody writes cherubs, because it's like making the plural. Okay, it's either cherub or no, I said it wrong. I don't like it when people write cherubims because then you're using the plural of the plural. So the I am is already the plural. And so when you take this word pure and you make it plural, it's Purim. Purim, Purim. And that's where the actual holiday comes from that the Jews still celebrate to this day. From the idea of dice, plural. Okay, the Purim or the Pur. That's where the holiday comes from. And we do have indication in the New Testament that Jesus recognized the holiday of Purim. We'll get to that some other time. So here we have Haman casting these dice to determine when he's going to execute his plan. And now in verse 8, it says, Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all other people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them or to allow them to live, is what he's saying. There is a people living among you, king, that they don't respect your laws. They shouldn't be allowed to live. That's what he's saying. Verse 9, if it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agathite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. So Haman's idea is to kill all the Jews because they're bad and they harm the kingdom. That's about all he says. He even bribes the king here and says, listen, 10,000 talents of silver I will put into your treasury for allowing me to do this. He's saying, look, not only is it not going to cost you a dime to let me execute these people that are bad, but I'm going to end up putting money into your treasury. What he's saying is that after I execute these people, I'm going to confiscate all the stuff they had and fill your treasury. But the king responds there in verse 11 and says, the silver is yours. I don't need it. Do whatever you want is the idea. So notice, though, the king trusts Haman. The king, he just put him in this position not long ago. The king trusts Haman to such an extent that he doesn't even inquire what group of people he's talking about. Oh, there's a group of people amongst the kingdom that are no good and they hate me. Oh, okay, well, yeah, go kill them. He doesn't even ask who they are. Are they Babylonians? Are they, who are they? Are they Grecians? Are they from Tyre? Are they Sidonians? He doesn't even ask. He trusts Haman to the extent that he just says, yeah, go do it. And that's what the king's seal is here in verse 11. The king's ring, that's the official seal of authority. In fact, you know this, even in Middle Ages, they would take the king's ring and they would press that into wax, right? And they would, even on documents, right? They'd scroll up documents and they'd pop that seal of wax right there to hold that shut. And so when that message got delivered to you, you'd look at that and you'd be like, oh, that's the king's seal. This came from him. And then you could break that seal and you'd read it. And that was the authentication that this came from the king. This has got his authority to do these things. And so that's the reason it says here that the king gave his ring. It's saying, here's my authority to do it. Go do it. You're on your own. Go do it. Yes, you have my authority. That's how much he trusts Haman. I want you to see that. Now, verse 12. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people, do you notice the word every? And to every people after their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed with the king's ring. In verse 13, the letters were sent by post, this is like postmen, delivery, unto all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month. That was the day that he rolled dice and said, what day are we going to do this? 12th month, 13th day, which is the month Adar, to take the spoil of them for a prey. In verse 14, the copy of this writing for a commandment is to be given in every province. It was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day. In other words, he's saying to all of his loyal Persian citizens, you be ready on the 13th day of the 12th month. Go execute any Jews that are around you. That's the idea. In verse 15, the posts or the delivery, the Amazon delivery of the day, they went out being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan, the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city Shushan was perplexed. And the perplexed, I really believe, goes back to the idea that they had just lost their first major battle to Greece. And the whole city is in perplexion of what are we, where is this going? Are we in trouble against these Grecians or what? And so in the meantime, Haman launches his plan. Remember, Persia controlled everything from India to past Egypt into Ethiopia, the whole way up into modern Greece. They owned all of this. Every Jew was at jeopardy. All of them. This is a plot to wipe out God's people. God has plans for the Jews in that day and in this day. There are promises to be fulfilled that God made to these Jews that hasn't come to pass yet. So this threat of Haman's is a direct threat against God's revealed revelation, God's revealed word that I have a plan for the Jews. I mean, the quickest way to your own death is to come against God's promises. And that is exactly what Haman is doing right here. So every Jew across the entire world is now at risk. But in the providence of God, in the grand plan and mastermind of the way God's orchestrating things, they have 11 months to listen, to be directed of the Lord for what to do. Now look, as this message is going out all over, hey, listen, on the 12th month, 13th day, if there's any Jews around you, kill them. There's time. If you're a Jew, what do? You pray, you think. I hope you come to the Lord even more than you usually do, and you say, Lord, what's your plan here? What do we do? How can we do this? And God's answer is always depend on me. Depend on me for salvation. Be ready to act in faith when I call you to. And when we get to the end of this story, Esther has a big part. But every single Jew that is now going to worry for the next 11 months, they have a part to play too. And wait for that as we get to the end of the story. Watch how everybody has a part to play in what they're going to do for deliverance. So all of these chapters, chapter 3, the plot of Haman has finally just been, just launched, just begun. Okay, here's what's going to happen. I have a plan to kill all the Jews. But why do we have all of these previous chapters? Why didn't this story start in chapter 3? Why did God even give us chapter 1 and 2? Why not just start with chapter 3? Why not the first few verses of this entire story is there was a man named Mordecai that was related to this Jewish queen, and Mordecai wouldn't bow to Haman. Why not start the story there? Because I think God wants to tell us something even today about how he's constantly orchestrating things in our lives. There's so many things behind the scenes that go on that we may not even know about them. And I think that's why he gave us chapter 1 and chapter 2. It's almost like God saying, listen, I want to let you in on a little secret. I've been orchestrating stuff since way back before Mordecai even refused to bow. I've been planning this for so long. We look at our lives today, we think of things that are happening, we think, I bet this one caught God by surprise. I think God would look at us 9 times out of 10 and say, no, look, I've been planning this, and I've been planning this. I've been taking these things out of your life. I've been putting these things into your life. I've been working on this for longer than you know. And we see that. He could have started this book with chapter 3, verse 1. But instead, he said, you know what? I'm going to give them a little behind-the-scenes look at this. I'm going to show them a little bit how I've been working things out. I've been taking things out. I've been putting things in to get everybody in the right position, to be ready to glorify me when the time is right. So watch for God to arrange the chess pieces of our life in His sovereign will to accomplish His purposes in His time. Sometimes God moves pieces out of our life. Subtraction can be good. Anybody ever had an old girlfriend or boyfriend and you look back now and you're like, man, I'm glad I didn't marry that one, Right? Right. I mean, sometimes subtraction can be good, right? But sometimes God then moves pieces into our life. Esther was moved in a new direction almost against her will. Hey, Esther, listen, you're going to be in a beauty contest. I don't know if I really want to. No, the king said you have to be at the beauty contest. Oh, okay, well, I guess that's God's will then, Sometimes things get moved into our life and we didn't even choose it. But God knows how to orchestrate these things to put people in the right place in His will. You think of Joseph, going down to Old Testament Joseph, going down to Egypt. He didn't choose much of any of that. But he was put in the right positions for all that he needed to accomplish in Israel to save his entire family. Jacob, his father, all his brothers, all of them were saved because Joseph was sent ahead. God orchestrated all those chess pieces ahead of time before they even knew they needed to be orchestrated for that famine. He knows what He's doing. And then finally, it comes and God brings these opportunities for us to show faith and to trust Him. These are the moments that we need to seize upon. Look for those chances and take them. And take them. There's an angle to these 3 chapters. I wonder if you saw this. This is different. We didn't mention this yet. Chapter 1. 3 people stood up before the king in these 3 chapters. Did you notice that? Each chapter had somebody that stood before the king. Chapter 1, Vashti stood before the king to defend herself. Chapter 3, Haman stood before the king to attack others. And in chapter 2, Esther and Mordecai stand before the king to defend others. Who do you want to be? Who do you want to be? I want to be that person that I realize that God is orchestrating my life so that when it comes time, when I have these opportunities to show my faith in God, I'm ready. I want to be ready to use it for something greater than just myself. And maybe we should all be like that. So whether life brings additions or subtractions, be ready to act in faith like Esther and Mordecai did. And just trust and believe that God knows how to bring things in and out of our lives. And He knows what He's doing. He knows what He's doing. It's for the best. Amen. Let's pray.